Welcome to Calming the Chaos podcast, where we help you find peace in a chaotic world. I'm Tracy Canella, licensed mental health counselor, certified eating disorder specialist, and advanced clinical hypnotherapist. Calming the Chaos podcast provides you with self-help resources for handling anxiety, stress, and overwhelm. It is not a substitute for counseling or psychotherapy. So if you like what you hear, please subscribe and share it with your friends. Thanks for tuning in. And now, let the chaos begin. In this episode of Calming the Chaos, I'm going to be talking about a subject that could be pretty daunting, and that is male-on-male violence. But don't worry, we have somebody here to help us, and he's actually written a book on this topic. His name is Brad Mewhort, and he's actually in the state of Washington with me, actually down the road a piece, if you might say that. So Brad has written a book called Peaceful Man, and we'll talk a little bit about that. He's had some experiences with male-on-male violence in his life, and so he actually teaches somatic experiences and contemplative experiences, and he's a coach. He's also somebody who could help you if you have test anxiety. He's sort of one of those people who is great on calming the chaos, because I know he's going to offer a lot of tips, tools, and techniques that we can all use, even if it's not related to male-on-male violence. So let's bring up Brad Mewhort, who's going to talk with us about his work and about male-on-male violence. Welcome, Brad.
Thank you, Tracy. Good to be here.
Yeah, nice to see you too. And this is a really, we're always told in school that we need a really specific topic to talk about, right, in our papers that we write. And yours is this concept of male-on-male violence. So I thought we would start out you introducing yourself to our audience and tell us a little bit about how you got interested in this topic of male-on-male violence.
In a sense, I would have to say I became interested in male-on-male violence as I realized how much of it I had in my history, primarily through my adolescence and a little bit into my early adulthood. And for a long time, I didn't see it as anything significant. It was just something that happens, that boys go through as they are growing up. But at a certain point, I realized how much I had actually been affected and how the extent to which my life had been changed by the violence. My experience of the world changed by the violence that I experienced, and how much trauma I had actually was, in a sense, living in my body that was there for me to work through, to find peace within myself. And, this was not something that happened overnight. In a sense, this happened through increments, through stages over a couple of decades. And I've gone through a long process of doing my own healing work and, coming to terms with how violence has affected me. And at the same time, I've for the past quite a few years, I've been working with men in a variety of contexts who have been affected by violence as well, and seeing the extent to which so many boys and men have been affected by violence.
Yeah, and it's kind of like a spectrum, and there's examples that we can give of just even the most microaggressions that happen, micro violences, if you will, to some of the obvious things like a fist fight or even an attempted murder. But so could you give us a couple of examples of how you were affected by violence when you were growing up?
Yeah, so definitely I like how you frame that spectrum. And in a sense, I will say that the violence that I've experienced is not even on the extreme end of the spectrum. For example, I've never been involved with gun violence. I've never been in a war zone. I've never been in a gang. There are certainly many boys and men out there who have experienced exponentially more violence than I have. And yet, in a sense, that's my point, that even having grown up in a, in a middle class family, in what you would think would be a safe community, I still experience this much violence. And this is what I hear a lot, is that even the men who have experienced the least violence have actually often experienced quite a bit. I was 13 when I was exposed to more violence for the first time, and I was being bullied quite severely when I was 13. My family moved across the town we lived in. I was going to a new school. I didn't know anybody, so I was kind of an easy target in a sense. And I was being bullied by a few boys, all of whom were much larger than I was. And my parents went to the school administration. They didn't really do very much of anything. It was kind of, well, boys will be boys. And my dad finally told me, the only way you're going to end this is if you fight back, if you just actually make it a fight with one of these boys. And at first I was like, I can't do that. They're all so much bigger than me. Even the smallest of them is so much bigger and stronger than me. I don't have a chance. And then one day there was an incident that happened where I had two boys holding each of my legs, and they were in a sense having a tug of war with me. And I experienced a terror that was I'd never experienced before. I didn't know if I was ever going to walk again. Like I'm going to say that was one of the most traumatic events I've ever experienced in my life. And when I remember that incident, there are clear pictures of it, but it's also kind of fragmented the way that I know is kind of a characteristic of a traumatic experience. And after that, having experienced that terror that I did, and how, in a sense, fearing for my well-being and my life, I came around to what my dad was telling me and said, okay, I have to fight back. And my dad taught me how to punch, how to fight. And, on the one hand, I'm very sad that, our culture is such that this was the way that I had to, the only way that I and my parents could find for me to improve the situation. And yet I'm also very grateful for my father's kind of insight and support in that way. I see it as a very fine balance, a very tricky thing to navigate. And anyway, I fought one of the boys. Then I was kind of being circled around a couple days later by a few of them, and I grabbed one of them and started punching him. And I actually even won the fight, despite him being significantly bigger than me. And in many ways, I certainly wouldn't say that ended the bullying altogether, but it was never again quite so severe, or, the way that it had been. And there were certainly positive aspects of that experience, but I'm also going to say, in my adolescent mind, I learned from it that the only way that I could be safe was to be capable of violence and willing to use it. And in a sense, that was actually the cycle of more involvement with violence. And, again, and all of the violence that I was involved in is at the relatively mild end of the spectrum as far as things go. And yet there was somewhat of an escalating cycle of violence for me throughout my adolescent years after that.
You mean it escalated even further than almost being drawn and quartered by bullies?
Yes.
Wow. Well, I have a couple of thoughts here, and thanks for sharing that story. And I'm sure you have more. This is just when you think about the terror that you must have gone through when you were going through that experience, and just the effect that violence could have, even though it is on that other end of the spectrum, not the gun violence or any other kind of like attempted murder, the stuff that's on the other end. But the effect that it had on you was probably pretty traumatic, right? I can't
Absolutely.
even think. Yeah. And then the other thing is, as you were talking about your dad and him telling you, this is how you've got to survive in this world that we're in. It's unfortunate that we have the world that we're in, and this is the way to survive it. That's what they do in prison, right?
Right.
Because if you are able and capable of fighting back and defending yourself, then nobody's going to mess with you, or fewer people will mess with you. And so it's almost like
Right.
a power struggle and a power dynamic that is in play there, right?
Absolutely.
Oh my goodness. Wow. Yeah. So in the psychology of things, I also thought about how bullies are made. And so sometimes they learn from watching adults do the behavior. So it's a behavior sort of thing. And then the other thing is it's done to them. And so
Yep.
they're just doing it and passing it down the line. And other times is there's that old saying, hurt people. So a
Yep.
person who has been hurt and or is hurting on the inside for some other psychological reason will lash out. So that's kind of sort of understanding the bully. But then you bring up this other point where it's like a bully could just be one of those people who is just like really hyper vigilant and looking for people who might harm them, and just say, nope, I'm not gonna stand for this. This is the world we live in, and so I'm gonna strike first. So who knows? Different
Right.
kinds of psychology and psychological reasons for that kind of behavior when you're as young as 13 years old, right?
Absolutely. And I do think that what you describe about in my words, the cycles of violence that occur, that those who have experienced violence are so much more likely to perpetrate violence. I mentioned this boys will be boys idea, and although certainly as human beings, and perhaps especially as male human beings, I think we're all capable of violence. We all have that capacity in us in some sense. I also don't think that it's a genetic inevitability. I think that it's a product of our society and our culture that we have these cycles of violence. I think that humans, boys, men, could equally be able to grow up in peace if we were in the right context and had the right culture to support that and bring that about instead. And from that perspective, rather than boys will be boys, I like to think of it as traumatized boys will traumatize more boys.
Yeah, that's a way to think about it, right? About violence. And you mentioned the cycle of violence. I wonder, well, I remember looking at the cycle of abuse, which may be what you're talking about as well. Not sure how you have described it, maybe in your book or whatever, but when you say the cycle of violence, is it kind of like circular, or is it like going downward, or what is the cycle as you see it? I'm just curious about how you see the cycle of violence.
I see it as a cycle that has crossed generations. Uh, if we just even go back to, say, the Middle Ages and the violence that happened then, that was, from what I understand, much more severe than any violence we have in the world today. And that happened between people in the Middle Ages, and then was brought by the colonists to other continents and perpetrated against the prior residents there. And not only are there cycles of being victims of violence, but I also see the perpetrating violence as being traumatizing as well. It's not just being the victim that creates trauma. I think that being a victim of violence and equally perpetrating violence causes people to disconnect from their bodies and carry trauma. So this is, in our ancestors were, committed violence, experienced violence, and this has just been passed down across the generations, so that, when any individual, when I, for example, was experiencing violence, I would imagine I was experiencing something along the lines of what these bullies had experienced themselves with at the hands of peers, brothers, fathers, who knows. And that, in a sense, this was all just being transmitted through me, and then the involvement that I became involved with, in a sense, I was passing that trauma on to others. So it seems to me we're in this whole pattern of violence, this whole network, in a sense, of violence. And in a sense, there's no isolated acts of violence. I think it's all happening in cycles, in patterns. And that's also why I think it's so important for men to heal from the violence that they've been involved with, because healing, releasing this trauma from the body, actually creating a peaceful being for yourself, I think has the possibility of ending these cycles of violence, and ending one act of violence, or preventing one act of violence, can also have cascading effects.
Yeah, and I think we're going to get into that a little bit more when we talk about the somatic and the
Sure.
contemplative practices too, like how the body stores the trauma and how you can work with that stored energy in your body. I am really looking forward to that part. Yeah, so here we are, and you were 13 years old. You learned how to fight, and you learned that this is the way you needed to survive in the world. And I think one of the things you said earlier, which I can't even imagine if you want to share another story, but how would it have escalated from there? Because here I was thinking, well, now everybody's going to leave you alone because they know you can fight, they know you can defend yourself, and so they're not going to mess with you. But apparently, that's not what happened.
So it happened much, much more. And I will say there were still individuals who were so much bigger and so much stronger than me that they had just no concern about me fighting back. So that was one aspect. Um, I think if you want another story that I could share, that I would say was an escalation of even that. With some friends and I were playing road hockey, and the the younger brother of my closest friend at the time, who was just a year younger, he was in this game, and I don't remember what it was. We got in some kind of what I would call a mild tussle. It became, we were, pushing each other a little bit. I was a year older and bigger, and so it kind of dominated that. And he ended up just getting angry and going home, which is, he lived just down the block. And like, okay, well, that's over. It was not a big deal at all. And then 5 minutes later, we've gone back to the game, and someone calls to me to look behind me. And there he is, charging straight towards me with a 10-inch kitchen knife, straight, pointed straight at me. And I managed to, dodge that and then knock him to the ground and get the knife out of his hand. And then other friends, came and kind of held him down and, pulled us apart and suggested I leave, which at that point seemed like a great idea to me. And so that would be an example of an incident where, and in a sense, I would say that was actually probably the most extreme uh, violence or potential for violence that I've ever experienced. That was really the only threat I've had with a deadly weapon. And
I should say so, right? That's a 10-inch kitchen knife. Seriously?
mm-hmm.
Okay. Wow. And you were able to get the knife away from him, or you were able to get away from that situation somehow?
Yes, I dodged the original attack and then knocked him to the ground, and I kind of held his hand and banged it into the ground until he let go of the knife. So,
Oh, wow.
yeah.
Wow.
And I
Well,
was, I think I was 15 when that happened.
so 2 years after almost being drawn and quartered, you were lunged at with a knife during a friendly game of street hockey. This is what happens in Canada, apparently, right?
Yes.
Which Canada's supposed to be this really peaceful nation. I kind of feel a little bit better about the United States hearing that story, actually, in a kind of a strange way. But we'll just roll with that. And I would like to say I'm very sorry that that happened to you, and I'm glad you survived. Oh my gosh.
Thank you, Tracy.
Yeah. Wow. So when we think about, for me anyway, when you look at the spectrum, and I could not find a spectrum of my own. I will create one, I'm thinking. But when I'm thinking about the spectrum of violence, I'm thinking what divides it in half is going to be like when you pull out a weapon, any kind of weapon. If it's a cell phone can be a weapon. You could throw a cell phone at somebody
Mm-hmm.
and strike them with it or whatever. I think that kind of divides it in half because there's all this other kind of violence that is verbal abuse, calling names, making fun of somebody, telling somebody that threatening to do something, threatening to. I remember having this happen to me when I was in school. This one girl, she said, "I'm going to choose you out." That's what they used to say back in where I came from, and I was like, "What does that mean?" Like I was thinking she was going to chew me or like she was going to bite me or something, but no, choose you out means that she's choosing me to beat up. And I remember being so scared, like looking behind me, and she
Mm-hmm.
rode the bus with me, and I was thinking, oh my gosh, is she gonna get off at her stop, or is she gonna wait for me? So just that kind of, and she never did anything.
Mm-hmm.
She never tried anything, but she scared me. Right. So that
Yeah.
is a form of violence. And again, on this end of the spectrum, if you want to say the micro violent aggressions, and then there's where somebody like maybe they'll hit you with their hands, which could also be weapons. But then what divides it in half for me is like when you pull out something and then you're going to strike a person with it.
Right.
Even you know, I don't even know. This sort of came up for me when you were talking about your dad. I was thinking about my own dad who used to whip us with a belt,
Mm-hmm.
and that's like huge for my brother. When I was thinking about it, I was thinking about my brother. There's an example of male on male violence with a belt.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
so then that was probably about the worst experience that you've ever had then, correct?
Yes, the worst in terms of most extreme violence. Yes.
Yeah. Well, gosh, so where do we go from here? I would like to be able to talk about how you were able to, I guess one of the things you said was to recognize how the violence was affecting you. Do you want to speak on that at all?
Yeah, and there's kind of been deeper and deeper degrees of realization, I might say, through many years in my adult life where I realized how much it affected me. And I would say where I first kind of came across it was just realizing how much anxiety I held. I was um, successful career, and in some sense it had a very secure life, and yet realizing how anxious I felt about really kind of everything. But when I dug into it, I realized it was in some sense underlying any other anxiety about a work deadline or a conversation or anything. This very intense anxiety in my body. In a sense, it was an anxiety of my physical safety and violence. And when I say anxiety, it's it was a very I was very functional. I've always been very functional in terms of it, but really affected by it just in my body and what I was feeling, and a disconnection through that anxiety. And And, there was, so when that became apparent, I did a lot of work with that. And I was like, okay, I'm through that. But then I've just gone in cycles where I've realized, oh, yeah, the anxiety is more subtle now, but I'm still experiencing it. And then continued to work with it. And that actually seems to keep happening. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I've worked through this anxiety. Like, oh, well, yes, that's true in a sense. And there's still deeper levels of it. There's still something there's still effects of it that I seem to keep becoming aware of.
Yeah, it's like kind of like survival fear, or like the feeling of anxiety is related to that feeling of survival almost, and it gets you in in the hormones that are secreted, like cortisol and this fight or
Yes.
flight stuff. And so it is in the physical body, and you noticed it present as anxiety. Did you see a counselor or anybody to help you out with that?
Yes, so I did early on when I was working with it. I did extensive work with a psychotherapist for many years, and I'm going to say that was certainly the beginning of my healing path. I went a long ways with that. It really got me deep into my healing process. I got a lot of insight. Really just became aware that some of these things, actually had an impact on me, and that weren't just normal in a sense, or maybe they're normal in the sense of being common, but were not trivial in terms of their impact upon me. And I do see that as being able to share stories with someone, to talk about it, to be encouraged to find awareness of these stories, and how they've impacted it, to be kind of the first step generally on a healing path from violence.
Yeah, we're not unaffected, right? It may be common, it may be something that happens in our world, and we're still affected by it, and sometimes years and years later, right?
Right.
Yeah. So when did you get into, and then we'll look at your book, okay? But when did you get into the somatic practices? Somatic meaning feeling in the body, right?
Yeah.
And the contemplative practices that you talk about in your book.
Yeah. So after I had done quite a bit of psychotherapy, it wasn't even necessarily my intention to go deeper with healing from violence and getting into somatic practices. It was actually, just having some discomfort in my body, some pain that I was dealing with, and, not wanting to go the medication surgery route. So started working with some somatic practices like Feldenkrais, Alexander technique, and started experiencing that actually there was a lot of synergy with these and the psychotherapeutic work that I was doing, that there was something in seeing the patterns in my life, and seeing these patterns of movement, of tension, of sensation in my body, and starting to work with those and let those move, release those. And I actually ended up getting more and more into the somatic side of things in a variety of ways. Something called the Alexander technique is kind of the somatic form that I've gone deepest with, but I've worked with a lot of other ones as well, and came to experience in myself, at least, that there's such deep capacity for healing in working with the body and these patterns of tension, sensations, movement in the body, and changing those patterns and breaking the patterns. It can really uh, shift insight, shift emotions, and really create a whole new way of being in the body. In a sense, we could say it's ultimately finding peacefulness in the body. And it certainly can be, intensity moving through the body on the path there. But ultimately, I think these practices can really help us find a home in the body, landing in the body, peacefulness in the body, really fully inhabiting our bodies in ways that uh, we may have lost the capacity to do through trauma.
Yeah, I work with the mind and the body, and I think that might be a little bit of what you're talking about, the somatic practices that you're talking about. That yeah, so the body, and you have, if you anyone out there has pain in their bodies, it could be actually kind of your body's way of telling you that there's something to attend to, and not to be scared by it, but to do what Brad did, which is actually meet it where it's at and try and work with it and
Mhm.
be curious about it. I'm sure you can give us some examples and we'll look at those as far as somatic. So some kind of pain or dis-ease in your body could be something that you could work with a somatic practice with. And you could also see a medical doctor as well. But that's a really good way to illustrate how the body can be your friend and telling you, hey, there's something to attend to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I don't see that it's not my perspective that all pain or all disease in the body is, from trauma or can be dealt with through somatics. And I do also believe that a great deal of it is that and can be worked with through somatics. So it's,
It's definitely something to explore, especially
yeah,
if all medical efforts have not been successful. And I
right.
think that's been my experience in the past as well. If there's nothing wrong with me medically and I still hurt, there's got to be something emotional that I need to do.
Right.
So tell us about what contemplative practices are. What can you explain that?
So contemplative practices are you might call them meditative practices as well. And they're certainly to be explored as kind of meditations and something that to sit with and to work with. And the ones that I talk about in my book are, for the most part, are around compassion and forgiveness. And some of that is finding compassion for ourselves for violence that we've experienced, finding compassion for others for violence that they've experienced or that even that we have committed against someone else, and then also finding compassion for ourselves for violence that we may have committed ourselves. And that can be a very challenging one. Also challenging can be finding compassion for people who committed violence against us. And all of this is a practice, and I would say an exploration. It's certainly not to say that you need to, or even that you should have compassion for, someone who is violent against you. And certainly, I think I would say that that is something to be worked towards. And at the same time, I wouldn't have any judgment of anyone who said it at this moment. I just have no compassion for this person who was violent against me. Yeah, that's totally fair. And that is part of the exploration in even considering feeling compassion for this person. What comes up? Is there grief? Is there rage? Is there anxiety? What is there? So these practices, as well as being, in a sense, bringing up an aspiration, also can bring up a lot of emotion and responses that actually need to be seen, that actually need to fully come through in the journey of healing.
Yes, as they say in psychotherapy, it's a practice, not a perfect, right? We're not going to be,
Right.
as long as we show up and we're willing to try and we're willing to even be honest, like you said, I honestly don't think I can forgive that person, then meeting that where it's at. And so it sounds very Zen, what you are describing here. A contemplative practice of it sounds like then forgiveness, self-compassion, meeting yourself where you're at, and it sounds like willingness to show up and see what shows up, right?
Right.
Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and I'm going to share the screen with you, and we're going to go and make a trip over to your website.
Okay.
All right. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
All right. So this is the home page of your website, and I'll go ahead and put that website up here. Yes, www.peacefulmanbook.com. And as you can see, here is the book. And it talks about male-on-male violence and its prevalence around the world. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the book and what you go into in the book?
The book is broken into 3 sections, which actually are along the lines of what we have talked about here. In the first section, I tell the stories, many of the stories of violence that I've experienced, my involvement with violence. And you've heard a couple of these stories, but there are many more. And at the end of each story, I present some questions, which is inviting you as the reader to explore your own stories of violence that may have been that you may have been reminded of, and to by reading my own story, and you're invited to consider how you have been affected by that story of violence that you may have. And I think this is also these stories, if you are working with a psychotherapist or some kind of listening professional who you are talking with, telling your stories to, I think that this could be used very effectively in parallel, to be reminded of the stories and invited to consider those, and then to be able to share with whoever you're working with.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like it's got that quality of a workbook to it. I've read books like that challenge you. They ask a couple of questions and then maybe do a practice or whatever. But that sounds really
Yeah.
super cool. And using it with your therapist or even in a group, I could see this working in a group. I know you do offer some groups, but I don't know if you center them around this book.
Somewhat, I would say loosely.
Yeah, so to be able to read a chapter and reflect on it, and then also just sort of consider how this has affected you, and
Right.
invite them to consider how violence has affected you, for
Right.
sure. So
Right.
awesome. Yeah,
And
and
then in the
so
second
oh,
and
go ahead.
third parts of the book, there are somatic practices and contemplative practices. And the somatic practices, there's quite a few different ones presented there. Different things work well for different people. Different things work well at different times. So I've presented several possibilities for somatic practices that are starting points for different people.
Right on. Okay. And there's a contact form here if you want to have updates from what Brad is doing. It sounds like there's online men's groups, other offerings, and they're related to the book. So here's a way of connecting with Brad and some groups and some information about this. This book is actually available on Amazon, and we can go ahead and there's the Amazon link if you care to do that, but we'll go ahead and take a little trip over there as well. I think it's always exciting when my guests have books on Amazon, so let's just kind of look at it there. There it is. Ta-da! So of course it has the look inside that is free, and if you have Kindle Unlimited, it is absolutely nothing. So check it out. It's on Amazon. And yeah, and is there any other venues that they could buy the book on?
It's only sold through Amazon at this point.
Awesome. Yeah, well, everybody knows Amazon, so we will remember that, and I'll have it in the show notes as well. Great, great. Well, so, you know, with a book like that has some sort of a, you know, sort of a challenge or an invitation for readers to look inward. I'm just kind of wondering what some questions or topics that people bring up about violence are. And the one thing that usually comes up for me in sessions, especially working with males, is this concept of bullying. And you've even talked about it being a thing for you. And so I guess there's this question about how or why someone being a victim of bullying could possibly be violent or become a bully. Do you want to speak on that at all?
So the way I see it is that when someone experiences their own boundaries being violated, their body being disrespected, their own life and being not being not being respected, there's in a sense a learning process that goes on there, such that having experienced that oneself, I think it becomes much easier to violate the boundaries of someone else, to disrespect the body and the life of someone else. So I think it's a very unfortunate learning process that happens on a personal level that so often can, not to say that all people who are victims go on to become perpetrators, because that's certainly not the case. However, I strongly believe that almost all perpetrators, if not all, have learned to perpetrate violence by being a victim themselves, of having the experience of their boundaries, their bodies being disrespected and violated.
That's an interesting way to put it, as far as having the body violated. And then all of your healing work goes back to the body. And that is so true, right?
Right.
Yeah, yeah. So not everybody will become a bully, but it certainly is possible through that process that you just described, for sure, right?
Right.
Yeah. The other thing is we talked about the cycle of violence and all that, and a spectrum of violence. And so it is important to heal from it. So if there is any tips or tools that you have to offer somebody, now we have your book, and so we'll go ahead and list that Amazon link in the show notes. So if anybody's interested, check it out. On a just sort of a basic level, is there anything that you would offer just as a tip or a tool to the audience, anybody who's experiencing male on male violence?
So for anyone who is, who would consider themselves at risk of perpetrating violence, I would look at that as being an anger management issue, likely for the most part. And I would actually say that person, my book and my work, that's not really who I am most addressing, is those who are, actually at risk of continuing to be involved with violence, to perpetrate violence. Though for those people, my encouragement would definitely be take professional anger management training and work with a psychotherapist who is actually, ideally even specializing in anger management, etc. Although certainly, any psychotherapist is probably going to go a long ways towards, being able to work with someone. So really, my book and my practices are targeted towards men who are not really kind of beyond the anger management and any likelihood of perpetrating violence in a reactionary way or anything like that, and who are really trying to go into uh, deeper healing in themselves.
Yeah, so more of the victims of violence, anybody who has been a victim of violence but is not experiencing the anger
Mhm.
management sort of thing, but the more the anxiety or the fear sort of based emotions that come with being a victim of a body violation, if you will, right?
Yes, and I would also say potentially men who have perpetrated violence in the past, but have really kind of worked through their anger management, and now are like, maybe even have remorse for violence they may have been involved with in the past. I mean, I have some of that in myself. I feel remorse for some violence that I was involved in, albeit it wasn't the most extreme violence. I, never crippled anyone or anything like that along those lines. And yet at the same time, there was violence that I was involved with that I cringe at a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. So choices that you have made, or you as a collective you, is what I'm saying,
Yep.
that you may have to make peace with, right? This is what I've
Right.
done, and this is something that I probably wish I wouldn't have chosen, or at the time it was an emotionally based decision made out of anger. And
Yeah.
I do have a favorite anger management book, and we'll go ahead and put that link in the show notes for people who are actually interested in managing their anger, because it's a really important sort of way to get started in this journey, right?
Absolutely. And I actually do from there want to jump back to your question a moment ago about just an action to take, and more than anything, wherever someone is at, I would encourage him to do whatever healing work is appropriate and that feels like a good fit for him. Whether it is someone who's still has an anger management issue, then yes, absolutely, it's anger management. That is his healing work at the time. For someone who's gone kind of beyond that in his healing already, let's say, it's simply to go deeper into his healing work, whether that's working with a psychotherapist, to joining a men's group, reading my book, getting into somatic practices, whatever it is, just please do the healing work that is appropriate for you, that is going to be nurturing to you, that is going to be your next step on this journey, and find this peace in yourself. I think it's so important in the world for men to be doing this healing work. I think it's important for our own lives, and I think it's important for everyone else too, because we've been talking here about male on male violence, and that's where males experience at least the vast majority of the violence they experience is at the hand of other males. But some of the perpetration of violence happens against women, against children, against animals, against our forests, against our entire planet. So I actually think there's a whole network of violence, and trying to eliminate any of these issues without addressing the male on male violence, I actually think is missing a big piece of it. And I think it's a very overlooked piece. So that's why what I see as being so important is just simply, men, please do your healing work.
Do something, right? If it's just talk therapy, if it's a self-help book, if it's buying a book like yours, if it's seeing a hypnotherapist or an energy healer, wherever you're at, right? And just do something.
Do what's right for you. Do what draws you. Do what feels good to you. And it may take a few tries. You may try something like, okay, yeah, not that. That's fine too.
Right. Yeah, very, very sound advice. So I do want to visit the last 2 pages of your website. I'll put the website address up again. And because I think there's really some really cool things on your website. Yeah, I really thought it was cool that you have actual somatic practices. See how I click here? You will get an actual file that it's SoundCloud file, but you can actually listen to a somatic practice. This one is 15 minutes long, right? And you can actually listen to somatic practices and contemplative practices right on Brad's website. Do you want to say something about these are all guided meditations from the book. So sorry, it takes me a little bit of time sometimes to realize what I'm doing here. So these are all from the book.
Yes, they are. So these are practices that let me say another way. Some of the practices you can just read and then do. You don't need to be kind of going step by step, reading and then doing. The ones that were more along the lines of you need to be kind of guided through, I created audio versions of them and made those available on my website, so that rather than having to read and go back and forth, people could actually just listen to them and follow those. But they are freely available on my website as well to anyone who's interested. If you actually want to get a sense for some of the practices in my book, there they are.
Yeah, I love that you shared these as well. And again, there's the invitation to subscribe to hear the updates about what you're doing. And so, yeah, there's forgiveness, there's healing the violence, healing victims of violence, compassion through language, and through the felt sense. So I thought that was great that you had those on your website. And so here is something that I wanted to also share. This is the information about Brad. And so if you are interested in learning more about him, and he even offers his email address here, which is kind of brave in these days, right? Because, oh my gosh, emails can be very, very time consuming to go through. So thank you for offering that resource. And this is Brad, and it looks like you're sitting somewhere on a park bench there. Very peaceful background. Yeah. Well, is there any other thing in closing that you would like to offer our listeners? I have, again, your website. You are on LinkedIn. I found you on LinkedIn. So go to LinkedIn if you want to check out Brad there. And then I also have this link here. And this, tell us a little bit about, it's a little off the track, but this is what you do too. You help people prepare for tests, and you have actually had some really high, if not perfect, scores on tests. Is that right?
That's
some pretty
true.
major tests. Yeah. So this is, you help people to do, is it test anxiety, or just to help them pass the tests with better scores?
I would say a combination of those two. Yes, I help people get prepared for a variety of standardized tests, and a lot of my students are coming from a place of at least a great deal of stress about the tests, if not anxiety. And what I do with them is a combination of helping them to be, let's say, intellectually prepared for the test, but then also equally importantly, being able to go into the test with a good state of mind, and being able to perform well, perform competently, despite the stress. So I actually use somatic practices quite a bit with this work as well, in teaching people how to be able to perform well under pressure.
And is it any test, or is it just a couple of standardized tests that people take, like the GRE or the SAT?
So there's SAT, ACT, GMAT, GRE are the four that I work with students on.
Great. Awesome. Yeah. So which ones did you get perfect scores on? I think you said you did, or I read it somewhere.
The SAT and ACT I can get perfect scores on. I came pretty close on the GMAT, but not quite.
Wow. Impressive, for sure. Well, Brad, it was great having you on Calming the Chaos today. I really appreciate you coming in here and offering us your expertise. And I appreciate the book. And please go and listen to some of these practices from the book. They're free. They're out there. They're on Brad's website. And thank you so much again for the perspective on male violence.
Thank you for having me on your show, Tracy.
Absolutely.
Good conversation. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for listening to Calming the Chaos podcast. You can find all Calming the Chaos podcasts on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Google Music, Spotify, Amazon, and on YouTube. You can also go to www.calmingthechaospodcast.com for more information and to see all podcast episodes. Thanks so much for listening, and I look forward to sharing my next podcast episode with you. In the meantime, take care.